In a cold cell in Hameln, Germany in December of 1945, a man picks up a pen. He is not a soldier anymore. He is not a commandant. He is a prisoner with a number, waiting for a rope, and he knows it. So he writes a letter, not to a priest, not to his family. He writes to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the man who helped defeat his entire world, and he begs him for his life. Weeks earlier, the same man had walked British officers through the camp he commanded as if giving them a tour of a factory floor. Calm, almost proud. Now, alone in a cell with nothing left to command, that calm is gone. The British press will later call him the Beast of Belsen. Right now, in this letter, he sounds like nothing more than a frightened man. And in a few days, that letter will not save him. His name is Josef Kramer, and by the time he sits down to write it, he has already been responsible for more death than almost any other name on the docket at his trial. The newspapers back in Britain have already decided who he is. The soldiers who found his last camp have already decided who he is. In a matter of weeks, a court will decide too, and there will be very little left to argue about. But to understand why a letter from this particular man landed on deaf ears, why the very idea of Josef Kramer asking for mercy struck almost everyone who heard about it as grotesque, you have to go back more than a decade, to a young man who joined a political party that promised order and ended up building some of the most efficient machinery of murder the world has ever seen. Kramer was born in Munich in 1906. Nothing about his early life marks him out as a monster in waiting. He works ordinary jobs. He is, by most accounts, unremarkable. The kind of man who would have passed through history without a single line written about him if the 1930s in Germany had gone differently. But in 1931, he joins the Nazi Party, 2 years before it seizes total power, and a year later he joins the SS. Within 2 years, in 1934, he is standing guard at Dachau, one of the very first concentration camps the regime ever built, at a moment when the entire system is still new, still being invented in real time by men figuring out step by step exactly how much cruelty they could get away with. That is where his education in cruelty begins, and it is an education he learns quickly and never once seems to question. Over the next several years, Kramer moves through the camp system like a man climbing a ladder. Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen. Each posting comes with more authority, more distance from the men who actually give the orders, and less hesitation about what those orders require. There is no single moment of radicalization historians can point to, no one event that flips a switch inside him. He simply keeps saying yes to each new posting, and each posting asks a little more of him than the last. By 1940, he is serving as an assistant to Rudolf Höss, the commandant who will later become infamous as the architect of Auschwitz's mass extermination system. Kramer is not a bystander in this apprenticeship. He is being groomed quietly and deliberately for something much larger than guard duty. In 1941, Kramer receives his own command for the first time, Natzweiler Struthof, a camp built high in the mountains of occupied France, overlooking the vineyards of Alsace. It sounds almost peaceful, a camp in the Alsatian hills, cool mountain air, a view that tourists would pay to see today. It was anything but. And it is here in August of 1943 that Kramer commits one of the coldest, most calculated acts of his entire career, an act so strange and so deliberate that even among Nazi atrocities, an era with no shortage of horror to compare it to, it stands apart. A Nazi anatomy professor named August Hirt wants to build a skeleton collection. Not a metaphor, an actual collection of human skeletons assembled for what he calls scientific study, meant to sit in a university institute in Strasbourg as proof of racial theory. To build this collection, he needs bodies. Specific bodies, still whole, still identifiable, killed cleanly enough that the skeletons underneath would remain useful specimens. 86 prisoners are selected for this purpose, pulled from Auschwitz, most of them Jewish, sent across the continent to Natzweiler Struthof. And Josef Kramer oversees their murder himself. Over 4 separate days that August, Kramer personally carries out the killing of these 86 men and women in a gas chamber he has had specially rigged for the task, operating it himself rather than delegating it to a subordinate. He does this not once, but repeatedly across 4 separate sessions, because a professor in Strasbourg wanted skeletons for a shelf. 80 of the 86 die this way, at Kramer's own hands, not through some anonymous bureaucratic order passed down a chain of command, but through his direct personal participation. Decades later, a German researcher will spend years tracking down the identities of all 86 victims, piecing their names back together from prisoner transport records scattered across 8 different countries, because for most of the 20th century, they existed only as specimens in a catalog, not as people with names and families and lives interrupted. That researchers' work is the only reason we can say, with certainty, that this happened exactly the way survivors and documents describe it. This is the moment that should end any argument about whether Josef Kramer was simply following orders. He was not a clerk, stamping paperwork somewhere behind a desk, 3 signatures removed from the killing. He was a man standing in a doorway, releasing the poison himself and watching it work 4 separate times, over 4 separate days, because he had been asked to and did not refuse, and this was not the end of his career. It was not a scandal that slowed him down or a mistake that cost him his position. In the machinery of the Third Reich, overseeing a mass killing for a university research project was unbelievably a credential. It was a promotion waiting to happen. By 1944, the war is turning against Germany, and the camp system is straining under its own monstrous logic. Kramer is sent back to Auschwitz, this time not as an assistant, but as the Commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau itself, taking command in May of that year. And 1944 is the year Hungary's Jewish population is deported to Auschwitz in staggering numbers. Roughly 400,000 people funneled through the camp's gates in a matter of months. Survivors and witnesses at his later trial describe Kramer stationed at the railway ramp, where new arrivals were split into two lines with a flick of a hand. The sick and the elderly and the very young sent one direction. The able-bodied sent another. One of those directions meant forced labor. The other meant the gas chambers almost immediately before nightfall. Kramer commands Auschwitz-Birkenau through the height of the Hungarian deportations, through the exact period when the camp's killing capacity is pushed to its absolute limit, trains arriving almost daily, the crematoria running around the clock. He is not managing a prison. He is managing an extermination site running at full industrial speed, and he is the man at the top of it, the final signature on a system built to erase 400,000 people in a matter of months. Whatever he had done at Natzweiler with his own two hands, at Birkenau the killing has scaled up so far beyond what one man could physically perform that the horror becomes almost abstract. Numbers on a ledger, until you remember that every single one of those numbers walked off a train believing, for a few more minutes, that they still had a future. Then, in November of 1944, as Soviet forces close in from the east, the SS begins dismantling Auschwitz, destroying evidence, marching prisoners west in the death marches that will kill thousands more before winter is over, forced on foot through freezing conditions with almost nothing to eat. Kramer is reassigned. His new post is a camp in northern Germany that, until now, has been a comparatively minor facility, nowhere near the scale or notoriety of what he had just left behind. Its name is Bergen-Belsen. Kramer takes command in December of 1944. And here is where his story becomes something the entire world will eventually see with its own eyes. Bergen-Belsen was never built as an extermination camp in the way Auschwitz was. It had no gas chambers on the scale of Birkenau. On paper, it should have been, relatively speaking, one of the less lethal postings left in the collapsing Reich. But as the eastern camps are evacuated ahead of the advancing Soviet army, Bergen-Belsen becomes a dumping ground, a final destination for tens of thousands of prisoners marched or shipped in from camps further east, arriving faster than the camp can possibly hold them, faster than anyone in command even attempts to plan for. Food runs out. Water runs out. The sewage system fails completely. Typhus spreads unchecked through barracks built for a fraction of the people now crammed inside them, sometimes 5 or 6 to a bunk meant for one. Kramer is in command through all of it, and by his own later admissions at trial, he does astonishingly little to relieve the catastrophe unfolding under his authority, requesting more supplies on paper while doing almost nothing to enforce even basic sanitation among the guards still under his direct control. Corpses pile up faster than anyone can bury them, left stacked in the open between barracks, because there is no longer any functioning system left to process them. By the time the camp is finally reached in April of 1945, the dead outnumber what any functioning system could process, and the living are barely distinguishable from them. On April 15, 1945, British forces arrive at Bergen-Belsen's gates. What they find there will be filmed, photographed, and shown to the world, and it will become one of the defining images of the Holocaust itself. Thousands of unburied bodies, mass graves being dug by bulldozer because there is no other way left to deal with the dead. Survivors so emaciated that soldiers trained for years of combat, men who have already seen the worst of this war, are the ones who break down in tears at the sight in front of them. Some of these soldiers will later say it was the first time in the entire war they truly understood what they had been fighting against, not as an abstract enemy on a map, but as this, standing right in front of them, still breathing, barely. Kramer, remarkably, does not flee. He does not attempt to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing front the way so many other camp officials do in these final weeks. He stays at the camp and, in one of the strangest moments of the entire war, personally gives British officers a tour, walking them through the horror as though presenting a facility report, explaining logistics and supply shortages as calmly as a man discussing a delayed shipment, seemingly unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the men listening to him are already deciding what to do with him. Whether this was arrogance, denial, or simple incomprehension of what he had done, no one has ever fully agreed. What is certain is that within days, the British press has already given him a name that will outlive every other title he ever held, the Beast of Belsen. He is arrested on the spot. And this is where the story shifts from a man committing atrocities with total impunity to a man about to face a courtroom for the first time in his life. The trial takes place not in some grand hall in Nuremberg, where the most senior Nazi leadership will soon answer for the war itself, but in the German town of Lüneburg, under British military jurisdiction, inside a converted gymnasium not built for anything like the weight of what is about to happen inside it. It runs from August through November of 1945, and Kramer is not alone in the dock. He stands trial alongside 44 other former camp staff, among them Irma Grace, a young overseer barely into her 20s, whose cruelty at Auschwitz and Belsen will make her almost as infamous as Kramer himself, and whose presence at the same trial turns the courtroom into a kind of parallel reckoning, the commandant and the guard who carried out his system side by side in the same dock. Survivors take the stand, one after another, describing what they witnessed under Kramer's command at both Belsen and Auschwitz. Many of them are testifying in public for the first time about things they lived through only months earlier, in a room full of journalists, translators, and the very men and women they are accusing, sitting close enough to watch every word land. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary act of courage, made more extraordinary by how raw the wounds still are. Prosecutors lay out, in exhaustive and unflinching detail, the chain of decisions and postings that trace Kramer's path from a young SS guard at Dachau to a commandant standing over gas chambers, over selection ramps, over a dying camp with piles of the unburied dead. They do not need to reach for embellishment. The documented record alone is damning enough to fill 3 months of testimony. Kramer's defense, when it finally comes, is almost mechanical in its predictability. He argues that he was following orders, that responsibility for the true horrors lay higher up the chain of command, that the collapse at Bergen-Belsen in its final weeks was a product of circumstances beyond any one commandant's control, disease and overcrowding, and a collapsing war effort, not deliberate cruelty. His lawyers point to the sheer scale of the crisis in the camp's last months, arguing that no single commandant, however capable, could have kept pace with the flood of dying prisoners pouring in from the east, as the entire Nazi camp system buckled at once. It is a defense built deliberately to separate the man from the machine, to make Kramer sound like a middle manager overwhelmed by circumstances rather than an architect of suffering. It is the same defense that will be raised, refined, and ultimately rejected in courtroom after courtroom across occupied Germany in the years that follow, a script nearly every defendant in nearly every war crimes trial of this era will reach for, almost word for word. And it does not work for Kramer, not with Natzweiler Struthof sitting in the record, not with a professor's skeleton collection and a gas chamber Kramer operated personally. Whatever chaos genuinely engulfed Bergen-Belsen in its final weeks, it cannot explain away August of 1943, when there was no collapsing front, no overwhelmed supply chain, nothing but a request from a professor and a commandant willing to see it through himself 4 times on 4 separate days. On November 17th, 1945, after 3 months of testimony that had, by then, been reported on in newspapers across the world, the court delivers its verdict. Of the 45 defendants, 31 are found guilty. 12, including Josef Kramer and Irma Grace, are sentenced to death by hanging. 19 more receive prison terms of varying length, and the rest walk away acquitted entirely. A reminder that even a trial conducted in the immediate aftermath of Bergen-Belsen's liberation, with public outrage at its absolute peak, still required the prosecution to prove its case defendant by defendant, rather than convicting the entire dock by association. For Kramer, though, there is no ambiguity in the sentence, and no path of appeal that will change it. Which brings us back to that cell in Hameln and that letter to Montgomery. In the weeks between his sentencing and his execution, Kramer does something that, on its own, deserves to be sat with for a moment. The man who personally gassed 80 prisoners for a professor's skeleton collection, the commandant who oversaw the selection ramps during the Hungarian deportations, the officer who watched Bergen-Belsen collapse into a landscape of unburied corpses, picks up a pen and writes to the man who commanded the very forces that defeated Nazi Germany, asking to be spared. It is not a confession. It is not remorse laid bare on paper. It is a plea, one final attempt at negotiation from a man who, for over a decade, held the power of life and death over thousands of people and who now, for the first time, finds himself with none of it. The plea goes nowhere. Montgomery does not intervene, and there is little reason to believe he ever seriously considered it. By December of 1945, the evidence from Lüneburg had already been picked apart in 3 months of open court, published in newspapers on both sides of the channel and weighed by a military justice system that had no appetite left for second-guessing a verdict this thoroughly earned. The sentence stands. On the morning of December the 13th, 1945, Josef Kramer is taken to Hameln prison, the same facility where the executions of his co-defendants will be carried out that same day, one after another in a grim, efficient procession through the same gallows. The executioner is Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most prolific hangman, a man who will go on to carry out hundreds of executions across his career, including many of the most notorious Nazi war criminals convicted by British courts in the years after the war. Pierrepoint later wrote about meeting Kramer for the first time, describing how he stared at the man they called the Beast of Belsen, and came away with the impression that he was looking at something less than fully human, an impression that stayed with him even though he prided himself on treating every prisoner, however monstrous, with the same brisk professional detachment. That was Pierrepoint's method, and part of his reputation. He believed hatred had no place at the gallows, that the act itself carried enough weight without theatrics. With Kramer, by his own account, he found that harder to maintain than usual. Kramer is hanged at 12:11 in the afternoon. There is no dramatic final speech recorded, no defiant last stand, no confession whispered to a chaplain in his final seconds that history has preserved for us. Whatever composure or fear he carried into that final walk went with him, unrecorded, the same way it did for most of the men executed that day. What is preserved instead is the letter, the plea to Montgomery, sent from a cell only days earlier. The last documented words of a man who spent a decade deciding who lived and who died, and who spent his final weeks trying and failing to decide the same thing for himself. It is worth sitting with the shape of that ending. A man who ran selections on a train platform, who decided in seconds which direction hundreds of thousands of people would walk, who personally operated a gas chamber for a professor's private collection of bones, ends his life. Writing a letter, asking for mercy. He never once considered extending to anyone else, not to the 80 prisoners at Natzweiler, not to the families split apart in seconds on the Birkenau ramp, not to a single soul at Bergen-Belsen, where he had the authority, however limited, to demand more food, more medicine, more urgency, and largely chose not to use it. And yet, when his own life is the one on the line, he finds the words easily enough. The British military court that tried him did not hand down that sentence out of vengeance dressed up as justice. It handed it down after 3 months of testimony, cross-examination, and evidence methodically laid out in a room in Lüneburg. Not a mob outside a prison gate, not a summary execution carried out in the heat of liberation the way it very easily could have been, given what British soldiers had just witnessed with their own eyes. That distinction matters, and it is worth pausing on for a moment longer than it might deserve, because it is the difference between what Kramer did to the people under his command and what was ultimately done to him. Kramer was not the only one hanged that day at Hameln. Irma Grace, 22 years old, was executed the same morning in the same prison for a career of cruelty that began when she was barely out of her teens, put in a position of near total power over other human beings, before most people her age had finished deciding what they wanted to do with their lives. 12 people died at the end of Pierrepoint's rope in the space of a single day, the largest number of executions he ever carried out at once. A grim procession of the same trial's verdict carried out one condemned prisoner after another. It is easy, looking back at a name like Kramer, to imagine one singular monster at the center of it all, a single villain whose death closes the story neatly. The truth the Belsen trial forces you to sit with is less comforting than that. It was never just one man. It was a system that kept finding people willing to say yes, at every single level, all the way down, from a professor requesting skeletons to a guard willing to open the gas valve. And that is really the question this story leaves behind. Kramer's trial happened because survivors testified, because documents were found, because a legal process, however imperfect, insisted on proving guilt before handing down a sentence, even for a man everyone already knew was guilty the moment the camp gates opened. Compare that to what Kramer offered the people under his command at Natzweiler, at Auschwitz, at Belsen. No hearing, no evidence, no chance to speak in their own defense, just a selection line and a decision made in seconds. So here's the question worth arguing about in the comments. Did Josef Kramer deserve the 3 months of due process the Belsen trial gave him, the same process he never gave a single one of his victims? Or does a man who ran a gas chamber with his own hands forfeit any claim to that kind of fairness the moment he walks through the door? And if you think he forfeited that right, where exactly do you draw that line for everyone else who still faces a courtroom today? If this is the first video of ours you have watched, this channel exists to dig into exactly these cases, the trials, the verdicts, and the moral weight left behind when the gavel finally comes down. We are not interested in shock for its own sake. Every story we tell here is built from trial transcripts, verified historical records, and documented testimony, because these events do not need exaggeration to land with full force, and inventing details would only cheapen what actually happened to the people at the center of them. Subscribe if you want more of these stories told with that same care for the facts a courtroom itself demands. Drop a like if this one held your attention all the way through the way it held ours while researching it. And before you go, answer the question honestly in the comments, not the easy answer, the one you actually believe. Did Josef Kramer earn the fairness of that courtroom, or did he forfeit it the moment he walked into that gas chamber at Natzweiler? We read every comment, And on a story like this one, some of the sharpest arguments come from you, not from us. See you in the next one.